This is a deck tech for Magda Brazen Outlaw at the end of 2024, based on the Magdanomicon, the Magda CEDH community's Mega Primer, that is meant to be comprehensive and help pilots make decisions based on their playstyle preferences or meta requirements. The things that this deck tech are going to go over are how Magda changed in 2024, the main combo lines for Magda in the current iterations of the deck, the actual different iterations of the deck, as in the different archetypes, mid-range, hard stacks, turbo stacks, and turbo, as well as the differences between them and their playstyles. Additionally, we'll be going over how to protect your win, some more combo adjacent information such as playing through specific Stax pieces like Grafdigger's Cage and Blind Obedience, or other things that might cause your creatures or artifacts to enter tapped, as well as some staple or pseudo-staple cards depending on the actual archetype itself. So there will be quite a few explanations of why you may or may not want to be playing a specific card, or why my particular deck variant is on something. And then we'll end with some frequently asked questions, and if you happen to have more questions, feel free to join us over at discord.gg/Magda, and we will be happy to answer anything that you might need further clarification on or isn't covered here. "2024 has changed CEDH a lot. Recently we had the bans removing Dockside, Mana Crypt, and Jeweled Lotus from the format. A lot of decks were hurt very badly by this, or they needed to fundamentally change how they function, just because Dockside made so many decks work. Losing Jeweled Lotus was a problem for other commanders, and in general, slowing down the format by not having access to the fast mana in Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus makes things a little bit slower. So Magda came out of these bans rather unscathed compared to some of the other decks, and some pilots would argue that she actually got better. One of the main reasons, though, that pilots believe that we got better is because of the Dockside ban. And it's not because Dockside being banned is good for the deck, because clearly it's not. Being able to copy an opponent's Dockside is a way to just win the game in a lot of situations. But the amount of things that we used to have in the deck that would allow us to copy Dockside or were tertiary to another strategy that was removed anyway helps give us so many card slots. Now what I mean by this is, like, if we look at the sideboard for my current deck, Cursed Mirror. Cursed Mirror was primarily used as a way to give haste to something like a Goblin Engineer, but with another card that we're going to talk about in a little bit, Goblin Engineer isn't really necessary anymore. So giving it haste doesn't matter. And with Dockside being gone, Cursed Mirror becomes worse. Same for something like Molten Duplication. While yes, this is still very strong with something like a Dualcaster Mage if their particular variant of the deck is still on it, it's not the best card in the world, right? It still has a lot of upsides. It's the best copy spell that we still have, but removing other ones like Heat Shimmer, Twinflame, if you're not on Dualcaster Mage, it being a backup win condition doesn't exist. And with Dockside not being in the format anymore, copying things that aren't like a way to help you make infinite treasures is not great. And it's actually freed up between 3 and 6 slots in your deck because Dockside is gone. Not just because of Dockside itself, but because of other things. Similarly, Null Rod used to be in the deck for some pilots because of Dockside specifically. Being able to take advantage of our opponents playing a Dockside, tutoring out our Null Rod in response to the ETB effect, and then making it so they make their treasures and give us a target for our Cursed Mirror so that we can potentially win the game through our own Null Rod. That was a relatively common line that was taken with Null Rod. But because of the removal of some of the faster mana as well, like your mana crypts, Null Rod becomes a little bit worse, and specifically because it doesn't shut down Dockside and make those board states where you can just win out of nowhere, makes it a lot less likely that it's going to be run. So the fact that I can cut, personally, Molten Duplication, Null Rod, Cursed Mirror, Goblin Engineer, the Heat Shimmer, and the Twinflame is like 7 cards. And that gives a lot of flexibility to the deck, and it leads to quite a bit of diversity as far as deck building goes. Gaining access to all of these slots arguably makes the deck better. And the format potentially slowing down because of the other bans also potentially makes Magda better. But the real reason why Magda got so much better in 2024 is because of 2 cards that were released. Pinnacle Monk with Modern Horizons 3, and Barkform Harvester with Bloomburrow. Barkform Harvester had the most impact, though. It brought together 2 different sects of the community. One group that was specifically building around Elixir of Immortality, which is similar to the activated ability of Barkform Harvester, except it just put your whole graveyard in as opposed to a single piece. And then another group that felt that Elixir was essentially a waste of space in the deck, and that you could win in other ways with higher card quality. But now that we have Elixir of Immortality's win conditions possible with Barkform Harvester, which is a artifact dwarf, there is no reason to not play it and not have it as the main win condition. So now the only thing that really separates the decks is the archetypes themselves, whether they're mid-range, hard stacks, turbo stacks, or true turbo, which is now technically possible because of the bans, and the secondary win conditions that each pilot decides that they want to use. Some pilots, and I should say most pilots, are using Pinnacle Monk as their main backup line. Because, like I said before, it being a land makes it so that it's rather easy to build around. And the deck building cost in order to have this as a win condition is not very high, in that you only need to run something like Zoyoa's Justice and Chaos Warp. And both of these function as relatively potent removal, even if it is at a downside. And then other pilots are on things like Realm Scorcher, Hellkite instead. But it really depends on how you're building your deck itself, because if you're on a land base that will function with MDSCs, then Pinnacle Monk is a more than viable choice for a backup win condition. But if for some reason that you're not, then this doesn't really fit how the deck is built, and as such you will need another win condition behind Barkform. So the first archetype I want to talk about is Midrange. This is sort of the middle of the road between turbo stacks, and hard stacks. And it more bases itself around being a draw-go style of deck, where you're looking to have as much interaction as possible for things that might stop you. Specifically things like Sudden Shock are used to deal with like Opposition Agent at split-second speed, so the opponent can't really interact. Similarly, Siege Smash stopping a Bowmasters from killing your Magda at a perfect timing, or preventing someone like a Kinnan from using a Basalt Monolith to win the game, or potentially using a Hullbreaker Horror to win or something, right? And then you have just enough counter magic in your Tybalt's Trickery and your Red Blast, depending on the scenario, as well as things that are pseudo counter magic by untimely malfunction, deflecting SWAT sort of effects, as well as Flare of Duplication, and return the favor. Otherwise, you're on a very limited creature base, and what I mean by that is that you're trying to go down on artifact dwarves versus some of the other archetypes which are trying to have as many as possible. Because when you're playing draw go, you don't really want to have yourself as the threat. And while generating treasures is a big threat for your opponents, generating treasures with an artifact dwarf on field already so that you can just win the game is hard for them to ignore. And then you have your value engines, your Xorn, your Roaming Throne for your extra treasures, your Academy Manufacturer for draw and extra treasures if you have copies of this. Your main win conditions being Barkform Harvester in conjunction with something like a Twinshot Sniper or a Lightning Bolt or Pinnacle Monk. Otherwise, it's mostly using the most impactful Stax pieces in the fact that it's using Magus of the Moon, Blood Moon with no Dockside. The only thing that really makes colors through this is like signets, like Arcane Signet, in all the 2-color signets, right? But other than that, you have God Pharaoh Statue to make your opponent's stuff cost more, Torpor Orb to stop ETBs, so no Thassa's Oracle, no Ranger Captain of Eos, etc. Unlicensed Hearst and Grafdigger's Cage to deal with the graveyard. Grafdigger's Cage to deal with your opponents taking things out of their deck, mostly creatures, in response to like green tutors and stuff, right? We're not necessarily playing this in response to it, but the fact that it stops it is relatively important. Damping Sphere to stop Cradle from being super impactful as well as being anti-storm. Vexing Bauble stopping free spells while also acting as a way to draw your deck through some of your combo lines. And then Disruptor Flute as sort of a 1-for-1 scenario where you're trying to stop a win condition, or in some board states, prevent something from coming down that you know your opponent has. Otherwise, it's just sort of the basic bare bones Magda stuff. You're looking to make your treasures, get to the point where you can win the game. The next archetype we're going to be talking about is Hard Stax. It removes some of the interaction package and creatures and vehicles in order to get more things that preemptively stop our opponents. What I mean by this is things like Trinosphere, early game causing all of our opponents' things to cost 3, can be debilitating. Similarly, Orb of Dreams causing all permanents to come in tapped is very hard to play through for decks that are using a lot of fetch lands. So 4+ color decks, sometimes 3 color decks, have a very hard time playing through this. And because we're playing things that we might want to get rid of, Grinding Station is an important tool, specifically because of Orb of Dreams, so that you can fight through the permanents entered tapped without removing a Grafdigger's Cage if you are technically playing it, or it's in play. You have things like Mishra's Workshop as part of your land base, so that you can more easily deploy your Stax pieces early, and then you are on more mountains than some other lists might be on to potentially enable something like a Winter Moon. You could use a Winter Orb instead. Otherwise, it's just things that increase the cost of spells symmetrically. So it forces you into a situation where you have to play around your own stuff, and your opponents have to play around it too. So if they're not comfortable playing around these taxing effects, or they're forced into these situations where an opponent might be able to potentially present a win even through them, that if they make the wrong decision to advance their board state when that might come up, that they just threw away the game. And if you as the Stax player can't accurately sort of discuss these points with people, or the pilots that you're playing against are not comfortable playing through Stax and understand when and how to do things like that, you can just throw the game by deploying Stax at the wrong time, or too many pieces. So even though you can essentially shut down the game, if you don't get a hard lock that you can accrue advantage through, it's very hard to win the game. Which is another reason why tournaments are kind of a bad place to play a hard Stax variant of Magda, is because realistically, playing all of these Stax pieces and accurately deploying them matters so much more when there's only an 80-minute time limit. If you can't hurry your opponents through their decision making, if you can't help them with their decision making, etc., it's much harder to win with this under those time constraints specifically. If you have 3 or 4 hours for your game, it doesn't really matter, right? But hopefully you shouldn't be putting the game that late regardless. You should be locking it down. But Stax is one of those things that's very difficult to play properly. And if it's not something that is your cup of tea, I would highly suggest not playing this type of variant of deck. The next thing is an example of Turbo Stax. It gets rid of basically interaction and one land in exchange for more ways to slow the game down early, such as Sphere of Resistance, Trinosphere, or Tangle Wire if deployed properly, and then ways to make mana early, like Mox Amber if your commander is out, or Ragavan. And Ragavan is in these sort of lists that are on Mox Amber just to get a higher density of legendary creatures. And then you have things like Rite of Flame and Jessica's Will to help with the more turbo aspect of things, as well as City of Traders as a way to sort of get ahead for mana as a sort of ritual. Trinosphere being the main extra Stax piece that is added to slow things down. And then you have Great Train Heist as a modal way to potentially win the game, either by making extra treasures through attacking, or forcing a situation where your opponents have to deal with you untapping a couple Dwarves, hopefully with a tap outlet on the field, so that you can win the game then and there. And then lastly we have Turbo. It removes a lot of the interaction, same sort of stuff that a Turbo Stax deck would remove, as well as things like Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, and harder to cast things like Dwarven Bloodboiler. It goes up things like Gamble, your Rite of Flame, your Jessica's Will, while also going on more Artifact Dwarves because it wants to be able to present a win as fast as possible. And having access to extra forks can help with that, because if you're copying a Demonic Tutor or a Vampiric Tutor to put whatever you want on top of your library, that can be very potent, and especially when you're copying a 2-field green Tutor, letting you get your Roaming Throne, etc. is pretty dumb. Gamble allows you to get the same sort of stuff, your Roaming Thrones, your Xorns, your vehicles, etc., and then it also uses the same Great Train Heist as a catalyst to potentially ending games, and Paradise Mantle as a pseudo vehicle, while being on Molten Duplication as another pseudo artifact dwarf to help you potentially combo off as well from a single activation. Essentially, Turbo is trying to win the game by turn 2 or 3 as consistently as possible, or at least present wins at points where other decks are not. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of decks that can present wins on turn 2 and turn 3 still, but because the format has slowed down, our fastest is sort of in line with a lot of the other turbo decks in the format. So how does Magda win the game? The first thing you have to do is make infinite treasures, whether that's tapped or untapped. Mostly this is done through things like Roaming Throne in conjunction with Clock of Omens, or Maskwood Nexus in conjunction with Battered Golem and a tap outlet. Alternatively, there are ways that you can sort of make a ladder to generating enough treasures that each activation that you use brings in a creature that will make one more treasure than the cost of the activation, which can then be leveraged to make 9 treasures as opposed to 6, and so on and so forth, until you get to the point where you can make infinite treasures that way. And this is done using a combination of Academy Manufacturer, ways to copy it, Roaming Throne, ways to copy it, and Xorn, and ways to copy it. Once you've made your infinite treasures, though, you have to find an outlet. So if it is your own turn and you have infinite treasures, you can use something like Magda the Hordemaster to make infinite flying 4/4s with haste. Right? But if it's not your own turn, and you're trying to win on the stack, you have to use something like Barkform Harvester and Twinshot Sniper, where you channel the Twinshot Sniper, use Barkform Harvester's ability to put it back in your deck, draw it out again, use the channel ability, etc., etc. The channel can be important to dealing with rule of law effects, which may or may not see more play in the format. And then you have things like the ETB effect from Twinshot Sniper combined with multiple copies of Roaming Throne. Because if there's 2 copies of Roaming Throne and a Maskwood Nexus in play, as an example, and then you are ETBing your Twinshot Sniper, 2 of the ETBs can hit itself, and 1 of them can hit an opponent, and then you can use Barkform Harvester to put it back in your deck, and then tutor it back out, repeat the process over and over and over again. Otherwise, the main win condition, or the main backup win condition that most pilots are on, is Pinnacle Monk. And this is when Pinnacle Monk enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from the graveyard to your hand. Similarly to the Twinshot Sniper thing, you want to have at least 2 copies of this trigger. So either Roaming Throne needs to be on the field as naming Jin, or with Maskwood Nexus naming anything, so that you can have 2 spells be put back into your hand from the graveyard. These are going to be a bolt effect, such as Lightning Bolt, Galvanic Blast, or Bottle Cap Blast, Sudden Shock as well, and then one of these 2, Zoyoa's Justice or Chaos Warp. These function as a way to put your Pinnacle Monk back into your deck, and then you can either tutor it back out if Maskwood Nexus is in play, or you can draw your entire deck, and then these will automatically cast or put Pinnacle Monk back into play. So it's a lightning bolt loop using Pinnacle Monk as a way to get it out of the graveyard over and over and over again. Otherwise, you have some scenarios where you can look to leverage other cards, such as Realm Scorcher Hellkite, Goblin Engineer in combination with making it a hasty artifact version to combo off with Clock of Omens, which won't be covered in this because it's not really used all that much currently, or Dualcaster Mage, which is used a little bit more often. And Dualcaster Mage functions in the exact same way as Pinnacle Monk, except instead of using the graveyard, you cast the spells, and then you have Dualcaster Mage enter, multiple ETB effects happen, you copy both of the spells, you put Dualcaster Mage back in your deck, you're still lightning bolting your opponent, so it's just another variant of the lightning bolt loop. The first thing we're going to talk about is Clock of Omens. The most integral part of the Clock of Omens loop is requiring an artifact dwarf. So this is something like a Universal Automaton, which is a changeling, as in it has every creature type. Roaming Throne, or a Adaptive Automaton or something, where when it enters you get to choose a creature type. Obviously dwarf. Or you have something like Liquimetal Torque, or Mirror of the Forebears, which allows a creature on the field to become an artifact with Liquimetal Torque, so you can target your Magda here to make her into an artifact, or make a copy of a creature that is also an artifact. So if you have any 1-drop dwarf, this will make a copy that is an artifact that will allow you to combo off. So the way the combo functions is you use the artifact dwarf as well as Clock of Omens to start the loop. To activate Clock of Omens' ability, it reads, tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. So as part of paying for this cost, you're tapping a dwarf, which will put Magda's trigger on the stack to make a treasure. You're going to target the dwarf that you are using as part of the activation cost for the untap, which will untap it, and you'll have an untapped treasure and an untapped artifact dwarf. You can then use the untapped treasure and the dwarf, targeting the dwarf for the activation of Clock of Omens, untapping it, making another treasure, and having leftover tapped treasures. This will leave you at a position where you can then transition into a way to make infinite untapped treasures, either by tutoring something like a Roaming Throne out afterward, or something like a Maskwood Nexus in combination with Xorn, or multiple copies of a Academy Manufactor. But ideally, if you're tutoring multiple things at once, like let's say you're tutoring Roaming Throne and then tutoring Clock of Omens, Roaming Throne is the best choice as far as your artifact creatures go, because it doubles Magda's triggers. This is important because when you activate Roaming Throne as part of the cost, it makes 2 treasures, which when it untaps, you can then use one of the 2 treasures and the Roaming Throne to continue the process, leaving you with at least 1 untapped treasure for each repetition of the loop. Now, another important part about this loop is that it is difficult to protect. So, if we activate our Universal Automaton and Clock of Omens to untap our Universal Automaton, it will put a Magda trigger on the stack to generate the treasure. Our opponents can react to this. So let's say they try to lightning bolt our Universal Automaton in response. Well, we have a Mirror of the Forebears on the field and some treasures. I can tap a treasure and my Mirror of the Forebears to untap the Universal Automaton with Clock of Omens activated ability. I can then use the Universal Automaton with any other artifact, such as a treasure, to restart the loop of Clock of Omens on top of the interaction attempt. And then if there's no other interaction, you can win the game. The Battered Golem line requires more activations to get all of the pieces, compared to just the 2 pieces required for Clock of Omens and an Artifact Dwarf. This requires Battered Golem specifically, any way of tapping, such as a vehicle or Dwarven Bloodboiler, along with Maskwood Nexus to make Battered Golem into a dwarf. Now, Battered Golem reads, it does not untap during its untap step, but whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. This includes itself. So if you're under the effect of something that is preventing your artifacts from entering the battlefield untapped, it will untap itself when it enters. That can be important for fighting through Stax pieces, which we'll talk about later. But in this exact situation, with Maskwood Nexus making this a dwarf, when we crew, part of the actual cost of this is tapping our creature, right? So it will generate a treasure token with Magda's triggered ability, which will cause the Battered Golem triggered ability to untap to go on the stack, and then resolve. You can then crew again, generating another treasure, enters, untaps your Battered Golem, and this is an easy way to make infinite treasures. This next section is going to go over a couple variants of the clone lines. Combinations of using Roaming Throne, Xorn, Academy Manufactor in ways to copy things such as Sculpting Steel and Mirror of the Forebears to force yourself into a situation where you can make infinite untapped treasures. There are a couple ways that this line can begin. It's either going to have multiple dwarves or 1 dwarf plus Magda and then Roaming Throne on the field, or it's going to be a situation like this where you have 2 other dwarves, Magda, and then you are on your last opponent in turn order before use end step. So in this situation, we're going to activate Magda, going down to 0 treasures to grab Roaming Throne on their end step. We're then going to tap Roaming Throne to generate 2 treasures. We'll go to our turn, untapping all of our creatures. At this point, Magda will make 2 treasures for each time that something is tapped. So we'll tap Magda, and we'll tap the Vault Robber to generate 4 treasures. From this point, we'll activate Magda, going down to 1. We'll get Sculpting Steel entering as a copy of Roaming Throne. When it enters, you'll name Dwarf, just like you did on the first Roaming Throne. You'll tap Dwarven Grunt, generate 3 treasures, because you now have Roaming Throne and Sculpting Steel as a copy of it, giving you 2 extra triggers every time that Magda triggers. You'll tap Roaming Throne here to make 3, going to 7, and then you'll tap Sculpting Steel, going to 10. Once you're at 10, you'll activate, using all of them, you'll grab Xorn, and you'll grab Maskwood Nexus. Now, Xorn is a replacement effect as opposed to being multiple triggers. So every time that Magda triggers, you'll get 2 treasures. She'll trigger 3 times for 2 treasures each, generating you 6. So you'll crew with Xorn, making 6 treasures. You're going to go down to 1, and you're going to grab Mirror of the Forebears. Once this is in play, you'll use the last treasure, or any mountains mana that you have available, to activate Mirror of the Forebears. Mirror of the Forebears then becomes a copy of Xorn. Once it's a copy of Xorn, you have 2 replacement effects and 3 triggers. So each time that Magda makes a treasure, you'll make 3. This will happen 3 times, so every time that you tap a creature, you'll make 9. So we're going to tap the Mirror of the Forebears to crew the Clown Car and generate 9 treasures. So from this point, you can do whatever the hell that you want. You can transition right into one of your win conditions, or you can generate infinite treasures by recurring things through the graveyard. Both of them technically use the graveyard. So you can either grab all of your creatures at this point, or you can grab a Battered Golem and then make infinite treasures at this point. Or you could have done it when you were making 6 treasures per tap, because, yeah. But realistically, this is for situations where you are laddering up, and we're going to go through the line as if Battered Golem has been removed from the game. So you then tutor out Barkform Harvester. You go down to 4. You tap it, you go up to 13. Now we use 5, going down to 8, to grab Dwarven Scorcher. Tap Dwarven Scorcher, go up another 9 to 17, and then you're going to use Dwarven Scorcher's Sacrifice ability, targeting one of your dwarves with 1 toughness, like Dwarven Grunt. They're both going to go to the graveyard. You're then going to use 4 of your treasures, going from 17 down to 13, to put both of these creatures back on the bottom of your library with Barkform Harvester's ability. You'll then tutor out both of them for 10 total treasures, leaving you at 3. You'll tap both of them, generating 18, going to 21. And then you'll continue this process using the Dwarven Scorcher's ability to sacrifice itself and kill your Dwarven Grunt, putting them back into your library with Barkform Harvester. Because this makes 18 total treasures, and the cost to put them back in your deck is 14, you net 4 treasures every time that you do this rotation. So it makes you infinite treasures, right? And once you have infinite treasures, then you can transition into some other way to win the game, like drawing your deck and then using Twinshot Sniper. The Academy Manufacturer line starts with a different board state. Academy Manufacturer, Magda, 1 other dwarf, and 5 treasures. All of them need to be untapped. Activate Magda, go and grab Sculpting Steel as a copy of Academy Manufacturer, or if you're going to be using Roaming Throne as opposed to Xorn, you'll start with Mirror of the Forebears if you have the mana to use it. So if you're using Mirror of the Forebears, you're going to name Assembly Worker, and then you're going to activate it, making a copy of Academy Manufacturer. Now, when there are 2 Academy Manufacturers, it multiplies the amount of treasures by the total number of tokens generated. So when Magda generates a treasure, it makes a treasure, a food, and a clue. So then that food and a clue will also generate a treasure with a second Academy Manufacturer. So it will generate 3 total treasures. So you'll tap your Vault Robber, or your other dwarf, and Magda to Clown Car, or any vehicle, in order to make 6 treasures. Once you've made 6 treasures, you will then use 5 of them in order to go and grab Maskwood Nexus. Once you have Maskwood Nexus in play, you'll tap both of the Academy Manufacturers to make another 6 treasures. You'll then go down to 1 and grab either Xorn or Roaming Throne. In this case, we're going to grab Xorn. Once you have Xorn, you will then have 2 triggers, or a Magda trigger is going to give you a replacement effect, causing 2 treasures. So this is going to multiply the stuff by 2. So it's going to generate you 6 treasures every time that you tap it. So you tap your Xorn for 6 treasures, going to 7, and then activating again, going to 2. Grab Sculpting Steel as a copy of Academy Manufacturer. Now from this point, you're going to end up getting another 3 treasures for every set that you do. So it's going to go from 6 to 9, and then you can transition into the same thing that you did before, where you're tutoring out Dwarven Scorcher and Dwarven Grunt, and looping it with Barkform Harvester. The other line that you can do is using Roaming Throne instead of Xorn, and then using Sculpting Steel as a copy of that instead. So if you were to do that instead, you'll have just made 6 treasures here. Right? You'll go down to 1. You'll grab Roaming Throne. Now, it's important that you have Sculpting Steel available if you're doing the Roaming Throne route, which is why I started with Mirror of the Forebears. So at this point, Roaming Throne enters. It's going to have 2 triggers of 3 treasures whenever it's tapped. So we now tap to Clown Car. This is going to generate 6 treasures, putting us up to 7. Then we will go and grab Sculpting Steel as a copy of Roaming Throne. This is going to give us another trigger. So it's 3 treasures for every trigger, making 9. And then you can again go and do the Dwarven Scorcher, Dwarven Grunt stuff, or you can tutor out Xorn at this point, and then you'll have 2 treasures for every trigger that is multiplied by 3. So it's 6 treasures every trigger. So 3 triggers times 6, 18 treasures. And then you can win from there just by tutoring out your whole deck, essentially, of all your creatures, if you really want to, without looping anything in most scenarios. But ideally, you're going to want to Barkform Harvester to win the game, but you can go and grab your Magda 2.0 and use the amount of treasures that you've made, 18 per creature. So at this point we have 1, 2, 3, or let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 of our total creatures taken out of our deck, plus if a couple died. If you have 27 total creatures, then you're going to end up with 18 times at least 20. So over 250 dragons that are 4/4s is enough to kill someone. Or everyone, I should say. If you are going for the Xorn line, you can start with Sculpting Steel as opposed to Mirror the Forebears. This will give you 3 every time that you tap. Go to 6, grab your Maskwood Nexus, make another 6, go and grab Xorn. Now this gives you double. So 6 for every tap, tap Xorn for 6, go and grab Mirror the Forebears, use that in order to make a copy of Xorn. Now this is going to give you 3 treasures for every time that you do it, multiply that by 3. Now this generates 9 every time, and then you can go and grab Roaming Throne at the end if you really want to, and then that makes 18. I want to talk about the 3 different draw loop variants. First we're going to talk about Academy Manufacture, and then we're going to talk about the One Ring. And then we're going to talk about using Barkform Harvester in conjunction with either Vexing Bauble or the One Ring and Sculpting Steel. Academy Manufacture 1 is the easiest. Once you have made infinite treasures, you just go about making infinite treasures again after Academy Manufacture is on the board. You generate clues, and then you can draw your deck using the clues. The One Ring loop is very simple. You tap the One Ring, you put a counter on it, you draw a card. You use Clock of Omens and infinite untapped treasures to untap the One Ring. Tap it again, add a counter, draw 2 cards. Repeat the process. If you go and you do this 8 times, you'll have drawn 36 cards. If you do this 13 times, you'll have drawn 91 cards. So you can deterministically draw your deck. If you have seen a total of 12 cards as an example, from 99, that's 87. So you need to get down to 78 so that you can tap the One Ring 12 total times in order to draw your deck. So from 87 to 78 is 11 cards. So you need to tutor out 11 artifacts or 1 artifact and 10 creatures using Maskwood Nexus and then 10 creatures so that you can pull the right amount of cards out and use the One Ring to draw the rest into your hand. The reason why this particular loop is important is because there are scenarios where you cannot get creatures from your deck. So you can't go and easily get Academy Manufacture if you're running it to enable your draw loop. So you need to draw into something that will allow you to remove your own Grafdigger's Cage. Something like a Zoyoa's Justice. And after drawing your entire deck, you will then have access to counter magic and stuff that you can use to protect your ability to remove your own Stax piece. So in this example, I'm going to showcase a win line technically. But at the same time, it's not something that primarily ends up getting used. It's just a way to showcase using the Vexing Bauble and then how it functions for your combos when you are doing a draw loop with it. So let's assume that you want to draw your deck. You tutor out Barkform Harvester, you tutor out your Vexing Bauble, you activate your Vexing Bauble. You draw a card, putting it in your graveyard, use Barkform Harvester to put it on the bottom of your library, tutor it back out, activate it again, draw a card, repeat this process until you've drawn your entire deck. Now in this case we're going to have already tutored out Liquid Metal Torque, and we're going to make an opponent's permanent into an artifact. Now we're going to use Clock of Omens and our untapped treasures to untap our Liquid Metal Torque and make everything that our opponents have into artifacts. We're then going to cast a Siege Smash from hand, destroying target artifact, putting it to the graveyard. You'll then use Barkform Harvester. Now with an empty library, this will put it as the only card in your library. Activate Vexing Bauble, causing you to draw a card, putting it to the graveyard. Your Siege Smash will go to hand. Vexing Bauble's engrave. You can then use Barkform Harvester to put this back in your deck, tutor it back out, cast your Siege Smash in order to destroy something else, putting it to the graveyard, putting it back in your deck, activating Vexing Bauble to draw Siege Smash, putting Vexing Bauble back to your graveyard, and then repeating this process over and over again, taking it back out with Barkform Harvester to putting it into your deck, tutoring it back out with Magda, and then using it to draw a Siege Smash after it's been put back in your deck with Barkform Harvester after it has been cast. The last variant uses the One Ring. So we're going to tutor out Barkform Harvester, we're going to tutor out the One Ring, we're going to tap the One Ring, and then we're going to draw a card. At this point, we're going to tutor out Sculpting Steel, entering as a copy of the One Ring. The One Ring is legendary, legend rule, remove the original copy that is tapped, put it into the graveyard. Sculpting Steel is a copy of the One Ring, tap it to draw a card. Activate Barkform Harvester, putting the One Ring on the bottom of your deck. Activate Magda, tutor out the One Ring. One Ring enters, legend rule, Sculpting Steel goes into the graveyard. Tap the One Ring, draw a card. Activate Barkform Harvester, put Sculpting Steel on the bottom of your deck. Tutor out Sculpting Steel with Magda, entering as a copy of the One Ring. Legend rule, original goes to the graveyard. Tap Sculpting Steel to draw a card. Repeat this process, basically ping-ponging between the original One Ring and Sculpting Steel, using Barkform Harvester to put whatever has just been put into the graveyard onto the bottom of your deck to be retutored out with Magda so that you can draw in between the legend ruling, essentially. That way you can draw your deck safely with the One Ring without having to worry about overdrawing, which I've already said before, you don't need to really worry about if you're just using Clock of Omens stuff, because there are ways to deterministically draw just your entire deck. The first set of lines that we're going to do is using Barkform Harvester, and we're only going to cover the most basic lines. So essentially what you're going to need to do is one of the draw loops, and you're going to be using Twinshot Sniper or Lightning Bolt as the card that you're going to be drawing. So you're going to cast your Lightning Bolt, putting it to the graveyard, Barkform Harvester it back into your deck as the only card remaining, draw it either with Vexing Bauble, the One Ring, Clue from a Caddy Manufacturer, whatever, from the section before this, replay it, put it to the graveyard, etc. Now, if there is a Rule of Law effect in play, you can instead use the channel ability of Twinshot Sniper. Channel Twinshot Sniper, put it into the graveyard, Barkform Harvester, put it into your deck, force draw it, rechannel it, puts it into your graveyard, repeat the process over and over again, killing your opponents in the process, right? So that one's very simple. The next variant of this is also very simple. You're going to have roaming thrown out. If you don't have Maskwood Nexus, it'll be named Goblin. Otherwise, you need to have Maskwood Nexus out. Now, once this is the case, you'll then Sculpting Steel as a copy of Roaming Throne. So you'll now get 3 triggers of whatever trigger occurs because of Maskwood Nexus, right? You'll tutor out Twinshot Sniper. Twinshot Sniper will enter the battlefield 3 times. One of these triggers will go to an opponent's face. The other 2 will go to killing itself, putting it to the graveyard. Use Barkform Harvester to put it back in your deck. Tutor it back out with Magda. 3 enter the battlefield effects. 1 to the opponent's face, 2 to itself, putting it back to the graveyard. Barkform again. Repeat the process until your opponents are dead. Now, one of the downsides to this particular thing is that your opponents can try to interact with the Twinshot Sniper with the ETB on the stack, or the Barkform Harvester with the ETB on the stack. As long as it doesn't have split second, you can then draw loop in response, and then go and grab either a Zoyoa's Justice or a Chaos Warp effect or even a Lightning Bolt or whatever to put your Twinshot Sniper back in the graveyard so that you can activate Barkform Harvester on top to get it back and then win on top of their interaction attempt. Winning with ETBs outside of just using Twinshot Sniper and 2 copies of Roaming Throne is relatively easy. You only have 2 copies. The first one is going to use Plundering Barbarian and Twinshot Sniper to have the same result as if you were to make multiple copies of Roaming Throne, and then the other one uses Sculpting Steel along with Spine of Ishsa in order to win through the One Ring, or at least destroy all their permanents to put you in a position to win on your next turn. The first one is going to use the Plundering Barbarian and Twinshot Sniper. This one is very simple. You're going to need Maskwood Nexus. You're going to first tutor out Twinshot Sniper, deal 2 damage to an opponent twice because of the 2 ETB effects. Then you're going to tutor out Plundering Barbarian. You can destroy an artifact of your opponent's, or you can make a treasure, doesn't matter, but one of the 2 triggers needs to go to killing Twinshot Sniper. Activate Barkform Harvester, putting it on the bottom of your deck. Activate Magda in order to tutor it back out. 2 ETB triggers. You're going to deal 2 damage to an opponent, and then 2 damage to Plundering Barbarian, putting it in your graveyard, allowing you to put it back in your deck with Barkform Harvester, and then tutor it back out with Magda. This allows you to destroy the Twinshot Sniper to put it into the grave, to allow you to loop this infinitely. Lastly, we have the Spine of Ishsa and Plundering Barbarian loop. If you already have Sculpting Steel on field, then you need to start by Spine of Ishsa targeting Sculpting Steel. Otherwise, you start with Spine of Ishsa targeting any of your opponent's artifacts. So this assumes that Sculpting Steel is now in the library, and Plundering Barbarian is in the library. Spine of Ishsa is now on field, having destroyed something. So from this point, you're going to tutor out either Liquid Metal Torque or Mirror of the Forebears. As part of this, Plundering Barbarian needs to be an artifact. Then we're going to tutor out Plundering Barbarian. You're going to get 2 ETB triggers. The first one can make a treasure. The second one's going to remove Spine. Spine goes to the graveyard, procs the LTB trigger on Spine. Use Barkform in order to put it back in your deck. So from this point, you're going to activate Liquid Metal Torque targeting Plundering Barbarian, or activate Mirror of the Forebears to be an artifact copy of Plundering Barbarian. Tutor out Spine of Ishsa. You're going to remove any of your opponent's permanents. Now you're going to tutor out Sculpting Steel as a copy of Plundering Barbarian. You're going to be able to target itself and Spine of Ishsa with the double ETBs from Roaming Throne, because this is an artifact. So these 2 will go to the graveyard. The LTB trigger for Spine of Ishsa will go on the stack. You'll activate Barkform Harvester, putting it into your library. Then you'll do the same thing for Sculpting Steel. You will tutor out Spine of Ishsa, targeting an opponent's permanent, and then you'll again grab Sculpting Steel, entering as a copy of the artifact Plundering Barbarian, 2 ETB triggers, target Spine and itself. Then you'll repeat the process until all of your opponent's permanents are dead, or removed from the game, obviously, and putting them in a situation where even with the One Ring protection, they will not win on the next turn. This line is relatively simple, but complex depending on board state. It uses Roaming Throne to double the triggers of either Dualcaster Mage or Pinnacle Monk. Dualcaster Mage doubling the trigger allows you to copy 2 spells, so you would put 2 spells on the stack and then copy both of them, or Pinnacle Monk will get 2 things that you have casted back from the graveyard. So Roaming Throne without access to Maskwood Nexus would need to either be on Human or Wizard for Dualcaster Mage, or Djinn or Monk for Pinnacle Monk. Maskwood Nexus is the only way to make the Pinnacle Monk instant speed if Pinnacle Monk is inside your library. However, if it is already a land on the battlefield, and you have access to Chaos Warp still, then you can still do this at instant speed. So, assuming that this is the case, you'll draw loop your deck, or use the One Ring and Clock of Omens to deterministically draw your deck. You will cast a Lightning Bolt, and then you'll cast a Chaos Warp, targeting your Mystic Peak. This will turn it back over, put it back in your deck as the only card, and then put it back onto the battlefield. This will then double trigger, allowing you to get your Lightning Bolt and your Chaos Warp back. You'll Lightning Bolt an opponent, Chaos Warp your Pinnacle Monk that's now on the battlefield, and then repeat this process infinitely. If you were to use Dualcaster Mage at instant speed without Maskwood Nexus, then you would draw your deck, cast Lightning Bolt, cast Chaos Warp targeting anything on the battlefield, holding priority between each, holding priority again, flash in Dualcaster Mage. It'll trigger twice, copy both Lightning Bolt and Chaos Warp. Lightning Bolt hits the opponent, Chaos Warp targets the Dualcaster Mage, puts it in the deck, takes it back out, and then gives you the double triggers again. So as long as you keep holding priority on top of the original two spells, you will be able to infinitely copy them. The Pinnacle Monk variant at instant speed requires Maskwood Nexus if Pinnacle Monk is in your deck. So the first step is you tutor out Maskwood Nexus, and then you tutor out Pinnacle Monk, assuming that Roaming Throne is already on the field, naming anything, because Maskwood Nexus. You're going to have it enter. When it enters, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. If there are none, you'll fail to find, and if there are, then you'll just put them back in your library. You'll then use the One Ring and Clock of Omens to deterministically draw your deck, or you can use Barkform Harvester and Academy Manufactor or Vexing Bauble or whatever to draw your deck as well. Once you have everything from your deck in your hand, you will then cast a Lightning Bolt targeting an opponent, and then cast a Chaos Warp or a Zoyoa's Justice targeting Pinnacle Monk, so that it gets shuffled back into your library, and then enters again, allowing you to get back both your Zoyoa's Justice or Chaos Warp and Lightning Bolt, to continually loop this to kill your opponents. Now, if you're not using Dualcaster Mage, and you need to do the Pinnacle Monk line not at instant speed, it's very simple. It's the same thing, just on your turn. You draw loop your deck, you play Pinnacle Monk, grab stuff back from your graveyard, deterministically draw your deck, play a Lightning Bolt, play a Chaos Warp or a Zoyoa's Justice targeting your Pinnacle Monk, and then the rest from there is the same. The only difference is that this needs to be cast, but if you are draw looping your deck on your own turn to do this, there should be plenty of things to help you protect your win, either by allowing you to redirect a spell to something else with something like a Deflecting Swat or a Untimely Malfunction, or specifically counter spells like Tybalt's Trickery, or things to counter other counter spells like Red Elemental Blast or Pyroblast. If you are making your own variant of the deck that is not necessarily looking to use the Barkform Harvester lines or the Pinnacle Monk lines, or want to use a specific land base that takes you off of Pinnacle Monk, and you also don't want to run Dualcaster Mage, then these would be the most likely scenarios. Realm Scorcher Hellkite and Goblin Engineer. Realm Scorcher Hellkite is the most basic win condition the deck has ever had. You make sure that it's on the field, and then you activate its ability a billion times, and then you kill everyone. Pretty simple. The only downside is that you need to make sure that your Grafdigger's Cage is not on the field so that you can tutor it. So you either need to use a Spine of Isha to remove it, or draw your deck and then use something like a Zoyoa's Justice or a Seed Smash, but it's the most simple thing. Just when you are using its ability, make sure to hold priority between each activation, just in case, because Trickbind is something that is played in the format, and you'd rather have 8 million activations on the stack holding priority before your opponent can actually cast their Trickbind and ruin your day. We then have the Goblin Engineer, Goblin Welder stuff. The Goblin Engineer is the version that I'm going to be talking about here, because it does have more value being a tutor to the graveyard that will let you take out your Grafdigger's Cage or a Trinisphere or something to generate value, right? Or even grab you a vehicle, depending on what you need. But it needs to be made into an artifact. And there's two ways to do that. One is to start by using Mirror the Forebears, make this activated to become a copy of Goblin Engineer. In this reads, Mirror becomes a copy of target creature you control of the chosen type, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. While this is an end of turn effect, it makes the creature have the main type as artifact creature, which means that when you copy it with Cursed Mirror, this is maintained. Unlike if you were to just copy it to begin with Liquid Metal Torque. Because Liquid Metal Torque is an end of turn effect, which does not move to copied versions of the creature. So you would have to do this afterward. So you would Cursed Mirror the Engineer, and then Liquid Metal Torque the copied version from the Cursed Mirror. Regardless, you're going to need to put multiple things in the graveyard so that you can actually combo off, because Goblin Engineer requires things be 3 CMC or less. So Sculpting Steel needs to be in the graveyard, as well as potentially something else. Or you can just tutor it to the field, doesn't really matter. But one of the two needs to put something in the graveyard, and there needs to be something that can be swapped out. At this point, you'll tutor either Twinshot Sniper, Spine of Isha, or Dualcaster Mage for you to Sculpting Steel infinitely to win the game. So we'll go through each line pretty simply. Twinshot Sniper's on the field, enters, does damage. Activate Goblin Engineer, or the copy of Goblin Engineer that's an artifact, in order to swap this out for, let's say, the Vexing Bauble. Enter as a copy of Twinshot Sniper, ETB deals 2 damage to an opponent. Then we're going to use Clock of Omens. So we're going to use 2 of our infinite untapped treasures to untap our artifact copy of Goblin Engineer. And then we're going to activate it again by using a treasure token to pay for the cost, swapping out Vexing Bauble and Sculpting Steel in this case. And then we're going to use Clock of Omens again to untap it, use the ability again, swap them back out, enter as a copy of Twinshot Sniper, deal damage, repeat the process infinitely until your opponents are dead. Alternatively, you can make Dualcaster Mage into an artifact, cast a Lightning Bolt, and then once you've cast your Lightning Bolt, Sculpting Steel enters as a copy of Dualcaster Mage, copy the Lightning Bolt, use the ability to swap out Sculpting Steel with whatever's in your graveyard, untap it with Clock of Omens, tap it again, or use the ability again, bring in Sculpting Steel again as a copy of Dualcaster Mage, copying the Lightning Bolt that you're not yielding priority on, and then repeating this process over and over again until your opponents are dead. Otherwise, instead of using Twinshot Sniper, you can have Spine of Isha be the thing that is on the battlefield for you to weld the Sculpting Steel in and out for. So as long as this is on the field, this can become a copy of it, allowing you to destroy all of your opponent's permanents and make them unable to play the game. Fighting through Grafdigger's Cage is simple depending on your board state. If you already have an artifact dwarf, you just have to find a way to remove Grafdigger's Cage after you've made infinite tapped treasures. And that's especially easy if you're already on Spine. But if you're not, then you just go and you grab your One Ring, and then you use your handy dandy loop chart that's inside of the primer, and you go about tutoring out artifacts 2 at a time so that you can untap the One Ring each time. So we tap the One Ring for 1, we draw our Maskwood Nexus, we tap our Maskwood Nexus and our Barkform Harvester to untap the One Ring. Tap the One Ring to draw 2, total of 3. Grab our God Pharaoh statue and our Sculpting Steel, entering, I guess, as a copy of Maskwood Nexus. Do both of these, untap the One Ring, draw. This will have drawn me 6 cards, and then draw most of the other artifacts in your deck. Outside of creatures, most lists are on 25+, so you should easily draw your Shatter in order to get rid of Grafdigger's Cage. Ideally it's Siege Smash, but if you don't have it, don't worry about it, because you can go and grab all of the mana that is colored. So like Mox Diamond if you have a land in hand, Mox Opal, you have access to both Great Furnace and Treasure Vault. So there's enough ways for you to potentially protect yourself with the cards that you've drawn as well, like using Untimely or a Red Elemental Blast or something to help protect your Zoyoa's Justice attempt, right? So once this is gone, you can then activate Magda a billion times, holding priority, so that you don't have to worry about Trickbind, and then win from there by going and grabbing your Roaming Throne and restarting your Clock Loop, etc. Not a big deal. However, if you don't have an artifact dwarf on the field already, you're required to get Clock of Omens and then get Mirror of the Forebears or Liquimetal Torque, or have one of these on the field already and then going and grabbing Clock. Liquimetal Torque allows you to tap to make something into an artifact. So in this case, our Dwarven Scorcher becomes an artifact. However, if our opponent uses a Lightning Bolt, as an example, well, our Dwarven Scorcher dies before it becomes an artifact, and then we're sad. Same thing if we target Magda. However, Mirror of the Forebears has the upside of being able to activate it multiple times. So as long as you have mana, you could activate Mirror of the Forebears targeting Magda, tapping this mountain. They try to bolt our Magda or Path to Exile it or something, and then we make another mana, activate our Mirror of the Forebears, and then have it become a copy of Magda, and then win with our Clock of Omens, doing the exact same thing that we would have done after making infinite tapped treasures, using the One Ring to draw into a Shatter or tutoring out Spine of Isha. So fighting through Grafdigger's Cage is annoying, but it is one of the more potent Stax pieces in the format at the moment, and sometimes you're just going to have to do it. Blind Obedience, Manglehorn, Dauntless Dismantler, Roost Maze. These are some relatively common, though Root Maze less so, ways that artifacts are going to come in tapped, or creatures are going to come in tapped from Blind Obedience. There's very few ways around this, as far as winning with combos, right? You either have to remove the Blind Obedience, which is difficult, as it's an artifact, or you have to have creature removal for a 1/4, or Manglehorn's a lot easier as a 2/2. But assuming that you can't remove it, how do you fight through it? The first option is Battered Golem. In combination with Maskwood Nexus, when it enters, it immediately negates the downside of all of these things. As it reads, whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. It sees itself enter. So it untaps itself, and that allows you to crew the Clown Car, make a tapped treasure, and then repeat the process until you have infinite tapped treasures. Then you can grab Sculpting Steel as a copy of Battered Golem, double crew, make 2 treasures. The first untap will untap both. You can then use both of these to untap a treasure. The second untap will happen, untapping both, allowing you to recrew with both of them, giving you infinite untapped treasures now, and you can win however you'd like. What happens if you have Maskwood Nexus in the bin, though? You don't have access to the Battered Golem Maskwood Nexus line with a tapper. Can you still fight through these Blind Obedience effects? The answer is yes. You need 10 treasures and at least 2 untapped artifacts on the field, or you need a Adaptive Automaton or any other artifact dwarf on field with 10 treasures available to you, untapped already. So we're going to assume that we have our artifact dwarf that is untapped. We're going to tutor for our Clock of Omens going down to 5. And then we're going to tutor for Battered Golem. It's going to enter and it's going to untap. We're then going to use our Adaptive Automaton here and our Battered Golem to activate Clock of Omens targeting our Adaptive Automaton. This is going to put a tapped treasure into play, causing the trigger for Battered Golem, untapping Battered Golem. Then the trigger for activating Clock of Omens goes off, untaps our Adaptive Automaton. You then use your Battered Golem and your Adaptive Automaton to activate Clock, targeting your Artifact Dwarf, and this will untap this and then untap this, making infinite tapped treasures. From this point, you can then Spine of Isha targeting something. If Spine is not available to you in your deck because you don't run it, it's stuck in your hand or whatever, then there are other ways as well. So from this point, you'll then go and grab Roaming Throne. Roaming Throne is going to cause 2 triggers to happen, and then you'll grab Sculpting Steel or Mirror of the Forebears as a copy of Battered Golem. So when you have the second copy of Battered Golem, you're going to tap Battered Golem and the Artifact Dwarf to activate Clock of Omens, targeting the Artifact Dwarf. This is going to put 2 triggers on the stack. First trigger is going to go off, make the treasure, untapping Battered Golem. You'll then use both Battered Golems to untap a treasure. The second resolution of Magda's ability trigger will happen, making a treasure, untapping both of these, and then the Clock of Omens activation will untap Adaptive Automaton, or your Artifact Dwarf. So you're then left with 1 untapped treasure, both untapped Battered Golems, and an untapped Artifact Dwarf. And then you do the same thing. You tap your Battered Golem and your Artifact Dwarf to activate Clock of Omens, targeting your Artifact Dwarf. Double trigger, untaps, use your Battered Golems in order to untap another treasure. Second trigger happens, untapping both of the Battered Golems. Our Clock of Omens then happens, untapping our Adaptive Automaton, and now you have infinite untapped treasures, which will allow you to win however you want from here. So another important aspect of this, though, is that if you're going to do this, if you have the mana available, using Mirror of the Forebears is best, because it transitions right into double Roaming Throne, and then lets you tutor out your Twinshot Sniper, and it also lets you use your Barkform Harvester, which is not down here for some reason, so that you can infinitely recur it. This coming in tapped doesn't matter, obviously. It's going to still kill itself, and your opponents will die. So if you need to find a way to remove the Blind Obedience or whatever, you can also tutor for Liquimetal Torque at this point, and then use it to make it into an artifact, find a Shatter with any of your draw loops that will now function because you have infinite untapped treasures, and a Clock of Omens to untap any artifact that's in play. And yeah, so it's pretty simple as far as going from there, but as long as you have 10 treasures and the correct board state, it is more than possible to win through Blind Obedience. Other than that, though, it's kind of a pain in the ass. The first important thing to understand is how to reset your Clock of Omens. So, assuming that you start with Adaptive Automaton and Clock of Omens, you're going to tap both of these to activate Clock of Omens targeting Adaptive Automaton. This is going to put a Magda trigger on the stack. Now, your opponent is going to respond to a Magda trigger, trying to Lightning Bolt your Magda. You can tap 2 artifacts in order to untap your Adaptive Automaton, and then use another one and the Adaptive Automaton to restart. If there's another piece of interaction, you'll need another 3 artifacts in order to attempt to restart. That is the main way that you can protect this from here. Once you have infinite treasures, though, the only thing that you need to worry about is your opponent's trick binding you. So if you've gotten to the point where you have infinite tapped treasures, activate Magda, hold priority, activate Magda, hold priority, repeat the process a million times, and then regardless of if they trick bind you or not, you still have all of the Magda activations to go through. The reason why this works is because you can technically fail to find an Magda activation, but also by the time that you resolve all of them, you'll have won the game, so it doesn't really matter. Dealing with opponents trying to interact when you're attempting to win is not that difficult, it just requires certain circumstances. So if you're trying to win with Clock of Omens, you would be activating your clock to untap your artifact dwarf. This puts a trigger on the stack, your opponent interacts with a bolt or something, right? I've already talked about this a little bit before earlier, but the way that you deal with this is pretty simple. Tap 2 artifacts to untap your dwarf, and then tap the dwarf and another artifact in order to start it again. If you don't have enough artifacts, then you're shit out of luck. Now, if you want to protect yourself after you've made infinite tapped treasures before you transition into untapped treasures, then you can get things like God Pharaoh Statue and Damping Sphere in order to prevent your opponents from being able to easily cast their spells, right? Now, there are very few things that your opponents can do to stop you, because you can just activate Magda on top of their interaction attempt anyway. So they're screwed if they do, screwed if they don't. But it never hurts to have the things in play to prevent things, right? Now, if you're forced into a situation where Maskwood Nexus and your Barkform Harvester and stuff aren't available to you, you're not on Dualcaster Mage, or you've already used it and it's in the graveyard. There's a bunch of very niche situations where you might need to make it to your next turn. So in those situations, you basically just grab out all your stacks, put as many pieces onto the board as you possibly can to give you as much advantage as possible. And then if you can draw cards with the One Ring to get interaction, to hold up with whatever lands that you have available, your artifact lands that you can tutor out, as well as whatever mana rocks that you can grab, can help you quite a bit. The fact that you can remove most of the creatures on the field with a portal, or a portal and a copy of a portal, helps. Or if you're on Tanglewire, you can do Tanglewire and a copy of Tanglewire to further restrict your opponent's resources. If you think that they're going to be able to win anyway somehow, through a Torpor Orb, a Grafdigger's Cage, etc., after all is said and done, then Spine of Isha, remove some resources, copy the Spine of Isha, remove some resources. Depends on what's available to you for your tools. You know, Spine, Portal, Sculpting Steel, these things are used in other scenarios, right? In order to potentially get to the point where you're making your treasures, etc. So they might not always be available, but this is the most common scenario where you're going to be looking to protect yourself anyway, is with clock. Because most other things don't really have the opportunity to protect yourself quite as easily. The Magdanomicon has a big section talking about staples, pseudo-staples, why they're in the deck, and all that stuff. It's something that you can read through at your own pace, but there might be a couple things in here that are worth touching on a little more. So, Magda the Horde Master is very powerful because of all the different one-drop dwarves that we have that have sacrifice and then target. So, the fact that this is strong because of that, plus our interaction, as well as the ability to use our lands to enable her, is very potent. Bottle Cap Blast is something that most people think about targeting their opponent's stuff, but you can target your own stuff too. So you can tap your dwarf and then blast it, and then make another 4 treasures, which is absolutely insane. Return the Favor does have the secondary effect of you being able to pay 3 to Deflecting Swat. This is not something that is the most important aspect of this card, and that is that it can copy quite literally anything. So you can copy a ETB from a Thoracle and then win with a Professional Facebreaker by exiling your whole deck in response, which is pretty funny. But realistically, this lets you double your Magda activations, or it lets you copy anything. So if your opponent's trying to play an Animate Dead or something, you can just copy the trigger and screw them. Outside of that, there's Volatile Fault, which I'm personally not on because right now I prefer red pips and the consistency for my earlier mulligans, but it is a very potent card, especially in a meta that is going to see a lot more of Gaia's Cradle. Now, as far as like pseudo staples go, Tangle Wire is something that I want to discuss, because if you play this early, it can restrict your opponents. But depending on what their board states are, it can also put one specific opponent ahead of others. And you need a very specific board state where this can help you as well, by acting as a vehicle, basically, allowing you to tap your dwarves. Otherwise, this might not help you as much as you think it will, outside of the situations where your last-ditch effort trying to get to your next turn to win the game after you've already comboed off in a way, where you don't have access to other stuff like I talked about earlier. Jeska's Will is something that a lot of decks are on, but a lot of decks also aren't. The fact that your commander needs to be out to get both is a little bit annoying. It's most commonly online, but the fact that it's reliant on your opponent's hands, it's very pod specific as to how strong this can be. If someone's drawing a buttload of cards with fish or whatever, great. This card is going to do a lot of work for you. But also, this is something that gets countered a lot, in my experience. And if it doesn't get countered, it's just going to end up in a situation where your opponents might be forced to counter what comes out of it. And depending on what your deck is running and how many redundancies you have for combo outlets, this can really screw with you if you hit the wrong things and you don't have the mana to put it on board. Sudden Shock and all split-second cards are amazing. Being able to remove Drannith, or not Drannith specifically, sorry, Opposition Agent, is very important. And being able to do it where your opponents can't really interact with it is just amazing. Now, there's a tons of cards that you can consider for the deck. Stuff that some people have considered are like Ancient Copper Dragon, but almost every pilot that has tried something like this has been like, well, it's a 50-50 if I win, and that's only if it actually manages to attack. So there are plenty of situations where you can generate better board states than what this might generate while making you slightly less archenemy. Otherwise, if you have specific questions about any of these cards that you might want to be putting in your own deck based on your own playstyle, feel free to hit up the Discord. So I was asked to go a little bit more in depth as to why I removed Pyroblast for Disruptor Flute. Pyroblast is very good at removing blue permanents. Primarily in this current meta, it's going to remove Nadu or a Rhystic Study or something. But outside of that, primarily it was used as a way to help interact to stop win conditions. Now, one of the biggest problems for our deck in specific is that outside of Tybalt's Trickery, we don't have counterspells or ways to interact at flash speed outside of Magda's activations. So Disruptor Flute gives us that. In situations where you're trying to, stop Nadu from winning, you no longer need to worry about removing Nadu, so to speak. You could just remove the ability for them to equip anything by playing Disruptor Flute from hand for 2 mana and then naming whatever the equipment is that they are currently using. Shuko, Greaves, whatever, right? But outside of that, it's very important to understand that there are interaction points with Disruptor Flute that exist that do not exist for some other things. You can basically let people hang themselves as far as putting themselves deep enough into a line that they can't go back. The fact that we can basically stop everything that Kenrith does, stop everything that Sisay does, stop Kinnan's activated ability, you can interact with Basalt Monolith, because of the untap ability, and you can even stop people from using the One Ring. It's basically the same thing as a Pithing Needle, but at flash speed, which means that it can be used as interaction. It also has the upside of spells with the chosen name cost 3 more to cast. So, specifically if you're trying to stop loops for Hullbreaker Horror, you could name Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Lotus Petal, whatever they're using. You can use it to increase the amount of things needed in the dockside count by 3. You can shut down breach lines by naming LED or Lotus Petal or whatever they're currently using. You can make it harder for them to stop you, depending on their actual board state, by naming things like Orcish Bowmaster or Opposition Agent. You know, if they've gone and tutored for something. It can help you force them to spend more resources to cast a Overloaded Cyclonic Rift, Toxic Deluge, Culling Ritual, etc. And it's really funny doing it against things like Niv Mizzet or Atraxa because they have very specific color requirements to play those commanders, and then they need 3 generic more on top of that, which is annoying for them. But outside of like commanders that have actual activated abilities like Kenris, Sisay, Kinnan, Najila, Thrasios, etc., you can shut down Emil Dockside lines, you can shut down Kiki Jiki lines, Ruthless Technomancer lines, the Necrotic Ooze stuff that would be used for Crick. You can shut down people's ability to use Witchclaw Talisman if you feel like it's just going to end up potentially screwing the game over. Ranger Captain of Eos, Temur Sabertooth, any Planeswalker, primarily Jeska for us because it stops from killing us over and over again. But there are interaction points for Aminatu, Tyvar, Saheeli Rai, etc. If a Sisay or any other sort of Planeswalker deck that should ever pop up gets that deep into their combo, where they may no longer need the actual Sisay activations to win the game, you can still interrupt their win condition. There are tons of things that it interacts with in the Nadu deck specifically. Shuko, Greaves, Seeker of Skybreak, Unctus, Apheto Alchemist, Sylvan Safekeeper, etc. It shuts down Glinthorn Buccaneer lines if people are playing Malcolm X. It can shut down Grinding Station if they're on non-blue Underworld Breach lines. It shuts down the ability for Derevi and Yuriko to evade commander attacks. There's also other things that can be important, like Time Sieve, Earthcraft, Candelabra of Tanos, Devoted Druid, though it's not as important anymore. You can even specifically screw with a Tivit player by naming clue tokens so they can't go digging. And yeah, you know, there's still stuff like Walking Ballista, shutting down the ability for our opponents to use the activated ability of Agatha's Soul Cauldron can be relatively big for some decks. And then, you know, you still have Heliod for the decks that run that. Other things like Survival of the Fittest, Razakath, Vilis, Tyam's ability shuts down the deck entirely, basically. Greater Good for the Dargo BS. You can stop Tameshi from using his activated ability. Dauntless Dismantler from making our life hell. Shorakai, Isochron Scepter, Birthing Pod, Goblin Bombardment. There's a lot of things that this applies to. So, because we're only able to interact with one thing with our Pyroblast, this lets us interact with basically like 80% of the win conditions in the format outside of Thoracle. And sure, having the counter to Thoracle with a Pyroblast is good, but there are a lot of other win conditions in the format as well that can't really be ignored completely by our deck just because we are probably going to see Thoracle more often. But even so, this particular card having Flash, being able to be used as an interaction piece, is a very different line of thinking that your opponents have to go down in order to protect their combo lines. Artifact Dwarves are an interesting aspect of this deck, and the first thing I want to cover is how many Artifact Dwarves is the correct number, and why. So this is varied depending on pilot, and what they specifically want out of their deck as far as their archetype. Turbo and Turbo Stax would run more Artifact Dwarves than Midrange and Hard Stacks in most scenarios, because those decks are looking to present wins potentially earlier, even though all variants of the deck can still present early wins, right? My deck in particular is on Universal Automaton, Adaptive Automaton, Barkform Harvester, and Roaming Throne. If you wanted to add most of the other good ones, or passable ones, then you would be at Mimic and 3-Tree, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then depending on the version of the deck that you're running, you could be running Ashnod's Transmogrant or not. But almost every variant of the deck is running Mirror of the Forebears and Liquid Metal Torque, which adds another 2. So that would put them at 8. So the difference between 8 and 6, as an example, is 48% to see it in your first 10 cards for 6, and 58% for 8. But that doesn't tell the whole story, because you're seldom keeping your first 7, so the likelihood of you going down at least to 6, especially in a turbo variant of the deck, is very high. So at 6, you're at close to 75%, 74.2. And at 8, you're at 83.9. That's a very high number, right? And when you start to think about things where you're combining both seeing it in your first 10 and your 2 mulligans, things change a lot as well. Because you're almost always going to see turn 3 unless you just get comboed out early, right? So realistically, if you mull down to 6 and you go to 10, and you see in 10 cards, I should say, having 6 Artifact Dwarves or Artifact adjacent things, or whatever you want to call them, ends up at 86% chance to be seen at least one. 8 is 92%. So if you want to get towards that almost guaranteed, that's where the Turbo and Turbo Stax variants of the deck sort of are. But you also have to balance that around your vehicles as well. And what is the correct number for vehicles? Well, for vehicles, it's the exact same sort of numbers, right? My list is on Flywheel, High-Speed Hoverbike, Unlicensed Hearse, Smuggler's Copter, Clown Car, and Mobile Garrison. So I'm on 6. So at 6, the same thing, if I'm going down to 10, I have an 86% chance to see one of my vehicles. So if I have an 86% chance to see one of my vehicles and potentially overlap with one of my Artifact Dwarves, that should be enough consistency when thinking about how often I'm going to be mulliganing. And if I don't mulligan, having a close to 50% chance to see either a vehicle or an Artifact Dwarf is enough to sort of propel my deck in the way that I might need for an early win regardless. But seeing these things in a hand that is functional is not always guaranteed, right? And that's the thing, is that you also have to think about the card quality that you're getting. Once you get past the Mobile Garrison thing, you have very crappy vehicles, realistically. They either cost too much to play from hand, or when you're playing them, they have a very specific purpose. Like Magmatic Galleon. There are some lines that do pop up, but they're few and far between. It may add like 2 or 3% win rate, right, by running something like that. And the amount of times that it might stay dead in your hand for the 2% you get from potentially the tutor lines that exist from it probably isn't worth it for most pilots. And you also have to think about things like Sky Sovereign or whatever. That does have the ability to deal damage on attack, which is very potent in situations where you might be able to play it because of Workshop or something. So what is good depends on what is actually in your own list. And, you know, we're going to be getting an entire set based around a death race or an intergalactic death race or multi-planar death race or whatever you want to call it in January. So we're going to potentially get new toys in this department. But as of right now, having something that deals with the graveyard, having something that gives us looting, mana generation, ability to flash it in that has crew 1, and surprise our opponents, these are all very powerful tools. And being able to play something for 0, or play it for 10, and then roll into a bunch of clowns that then become dwarves because of our Maskwood Nexus, is also potentially important. So, like, when thinking about the amount of artifact dwarves and the amount of vehicles, they both sort of push the deck in the same way, where you want to have access to them for your main game plan, and having access to your Roaming Throne or your Barkform or whatever early, Roaming Throne is a godsend, right? And it can potentially end games. But putting Barkform out onto the field when you're not certain that you're going to win can be a risk, because if it dies and goes to the graveyard, you lose one of your win conditions. So stuff like that is also taken into account when, like, thinking about certain amounts of creatures that you're playing as far as artifact dwarves and their purpose. The first Stax piece we're going to talk about is Vexing Bauble. This is seen in almost every version of the deck because it stops free spells. So even though Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt are gone, it is still very powerful. It also acts as an avenue for a draw loop with your Barkform Harvester. Damping Sphere is anti-storm. This is seen in a lot more variants of the list, but some mid-range lists don't run it. Disruptor Flute is not seen as often, but it can be a viable Stax piece even though it is a single target. Sphere of Resistance and Thorn of Amethyst. Now, these are in Turbo Stax and Hard Stax variants of the deck. Mostly the reason why they're on it is because their main goal isn't to play Magda early, it's to generate a board state that is hard to play through for the opponents. So Sphere of Resistance making everything cost 1 more symmetrically is something that we can usually play through, but it can be quite difficult sometimes. Specifically, why a lot of the versions of the deck that are playing these effects are not on as much interaction is because that interaction is harder to play. So you only play the best stuff, and you only play the most impactful things, such as Bottle Cap Blast, Flare of Duplication, Deflecting Swat, Abrade, Return the Favor, and depending on your version of the list, what sort of backup win condition you're on, it would be something like Zoyoa's Justice and Chaos Warp. But Chaos Warp is very hard to cast when you have either Thorn of Amethyst or Sphere of Resistance in play. And with the meta being more creature-reliant now, Sphere of Resistance gets a lot more bang for your buck compared to Thorn of Amethyst. Thorn of Amethyst does help stop things like Rockside, though. Torpor Orb is basically in every version of the deck because stopping Thoracle is wonderful. And there are plenty of other ETB effects that you might want to stop, because plenty of combos use them, right? Outside of that, we next have the moon effects, Winter Moon and Winter Orb. Winter Orb specifically doesn't untap all lands, only 1 land per turn. This makes it so that depending on the board state, specifically, your opponents may get ahead of you. If you don't have a very dwarf-heavy board state that allows you to make treasures and sort of snowball ahead, these sort of effects can screw you over quite a bit. Winter Moon is a little bit more consistent for decks that are built around it because you can use more basics, right? But for the most part, most decks are not on these effects because they're hard to deploy at the correct time. That doesn't either slingshot another opponent ahead that has quite a few mana rocks, or doesn't put you in a situation where your opponents need to make that hard decision of, do I untap a land this turn and then not do anything? Do I hold up interaction? Do I play this mana rock out to try to advance my board state, etc.? It can force some poor decision making from your opponents, and depending on which version of the moon effect you are on, or winter effect you are on, it can lead to some hard decisions for yourself as well. Next is Orb of Dreams. Originally this was played because Dockside was a problematic creature, and it could, like Null Rod, slow down or stop Dockside lines, while still leaving the treasures on the board and a Dockside on the board that you can copy, and because Dockside is gone, this is a lot worse. While it still does slow down every deck in the format, because every permanent coming into play tapped just is annoying to deal with, especially lands and fetch lands in specific, it doesn't really earn a slot in most of the versions of the deck currently, because of how the meta has evolved. It still is a viable piece, but only like hard stacks variants of the deck are going to run something like this. Tanglewire is an interesting stacks piece because if it's deployed properly, you will slingshot ahead of your opponents as far as the value goes. But if you deploy it improperly, it's going to put one of your opponents ahead of the other two, and then it's going to put you in a position where you're sort of trying to race that other opponent, and in a Staxier version of the deck it's a little bit harder to do, especially if your other opponents are forced to hold up interaction to prevent the other player that is getting ahead in check. Trinisphere is basically mono-red Rule of Law in the early game, but our deck specifically is on so many low CMC or mana value things that it's hard to play through Trinisphere ourselves. So if we're trying to be, casting our Lightning Bolts, our Galvanic Blasts, even our Abrades or whatever, all of these things that are 2 CMC or less, all of our 1-drop Dwarves, it impacts us quite a bit to be forced to pay 3. It impacts a lot of other decks more because it completely shuts down a lot of options available to them, and they then need to pay 3 to, Chain of Vapor this back to our hand or something. But you have to be very confident in your ability to play through the board states that this generates, and playing this out before putting down Magda and other things can lead to some hard decision making as far as what you're going to be attacking into and if you're going to be attacking at all, and sort of leads to a position where you might actually need a Tabber to maximize the value of a Trinisphere being in play. Just like this might be the course of action you need to take when you are dealing with a Winter Moon or a Winter Orb board state as well. Next we have Ubamask. Ubamask specifically shuts down card draw and turns it into impulse draw. This is very good against Bowmaster, and it's also good against decks that are trying to accrue a lot of value with Fish and Ristic and Crom triggers or Esper Sentinel, etc., etc. But it loses specifically to Drannith Magistrate. So if your opponents have access to enough mana and they can tutor Drannith, you've put yourself into a bad position. So this being deployed after other stacks pieces, like a Trinisphere or like a Winter Moon or something, can make it very difficult for your opponents to deal with. But because of how it functions and the type of decks that it stops, it doesn't necessarily prevent every deck from being able to win the game equally. And it's mostly the draw-heavy blue decks, which draw is one of the most important aspects of CEDH, and realistically this can do quite a bit to help deal with the decks where that is their main game plan, is to just accrue these value engines. But again, it's at a risk. And then we have God Pharaoh statue. This is a staple in the deck. It's not going anywhere anytime fast or anytime soon. Making our opponent's stuff cost 2 more to cast regardless is very powerful, whether it's creatures or whatever. This can shut down quite a few combo lines, but realistically it just is resource denial, which is very important depending on the board state that your opponent has. And then you have the moon effects. Non-basic lands or mountains. 3 and 4 color decks are very prone to Blood Moon now that Dockside is gone. They can't use one of their mana rocks to tutor for a Dockside with their Demonic Tutor and then generate the mana they need to continue with their game plan. That's just not an option for them anymore. So removing a Blood Moon or a Magus of the Moon can be quite difficult. And then lastly we have Chalice of the Void and Null Rod. Chalice of the Void doesn't see as much play because the Vexing Bauble exists, and there aren't as many zero-cost spells, period, in the format. If you're trying to stop a Force of Will or something, it still technically has a higher CMC than 0. So, with Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt being gone, it hits significantly less things. If you're not on the play, or in seat 1, and playing this on turn 1 for 0, then it doesn't really give you all that much value, and Chalice on 1 or 2 definitely screws us more than other players normally, unless it's specifically going to counteract one of their combos. And even then, it still screws you over. Null Rod is something that we played similar to Orb of Dreams, where it shuts down the ability for our opponents to use their mana rocks, so it's very hard for almost every deck in the format that uses a high density of them to function. Especially decks that are on greedy mana bases like Rogsai. And it also stopped Dockside lines. One of the reasons why this was so powerful was because this, in combination with Blood Moon, essentially locked out the game for our opponents. They couldn't use a Dockside to make the mana they needed to fight through the Blood Moon effect, and if they tried to play a Dockside for when the Null Rod eventually gets Chain of Vapored or blown up or whatever, that just gives you the opportunity to use your own means of copying Dockside to your advantage, right? To eventually leverage that into your win. But those lines of play don't exist anymore, so the main reason to play Null Rod would be for the locks that exist with Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. And the deck doesn't really run many tutors, outside of some variants of the deck that are on Gamble. We were originally on Imperial Recruiter when Dockside was in the format, because being able to have flexibility in what you're getting with Magus, Dockside, and some other creatures was very potent. But without access to Dockside and that potential just win out of nowhere, so to speak, the effect of Null Rod is not quite as strong. It's still very potent and it still does exactly what it needs to, but if you're not on a hard stacks plan and your board state doesn't already include an opponent that is going to be very open, or a specific Dwarven Blood Boiler, then it's very difficult to play through our own stacks piece, which means that most of the decks that were on it no longer are going to be on it. And then lastly, we have Grafdigger's Cage. Grafdigger's Cage is one of the most important stacks pieces in the format. It stops a absolute crapload of lines, It prevents your opponents from using the graveyard for resummoning creatures. It prevents the opponents from escaping anything, so your traditional breach lines are gone. And players can't use things like Bolas's Citadel to accrue value as well. So it shuts down a lot of things that Rogsai is looking to do in specific, while also preventing opponents from tutoring creatures to the field with something like a Green Sun Zenith or a Court of Calling or anything like that. And with green seeing a little bit more play now, this can do very well to shut those things down. The downside is if you are on fork effects or are looking to actively fork the effects to bring a creature onto the battlefield so that you can get your roaming throne or whatever, this can stop that from happening. And it also stops you from doing a lot of the backup win conditions or backup lines for making infinite treasures, and you're pigeonholed into using one specific line with Clock of Omens. And if that doesn't work, then you're kind of screwed unless you specifically draw into your answers. So if you don't have a One Ring on the field, then it's quite difficult to combo through Grafdigger's Cage unless you just naturally hit creatures that will allow you to combo. Hitting your artifact dwarves matters a lot when Grafdigger's Cage is in play, or hitting things like a Academy Manufactor or a Xorn or something that will allow you to pivot into another potential line that may not need another creature. Let's talk about dragons. Why are dragons not really seen? For a long time, being able to ping our opponents down at instant speed with Realm Scorcher Hellkite or Skargan Hellkite or something was seen as a really good win condition. The card quality was suspect, though, because either the creature cost 5 or 6 mana, and getting to that in the mid-game wasn't always consistent with how most of our game plan went. But as decks started to cut lower card quality cards, and we had a lot of other ways to win, the dragons sort of just fell by the wayside. So if we go through some of the other dragons that are in the format, such as Udvara Hellkite, the reason to play something like this is much less than it was previously. Unless you're playing like a hard Stax list, you're not going to get to the point where you're paying 8 mana for this, and you still need a bunch of other dragons or changelings or whatever to generate the value from it. You have things like Terror of the Peaks, which was once used as a win condition through Null Rod because of the ETB effect. That is still certainly viable for lists that are running Null Rod specifically, but most lists, especially post-ban, are not really looking to deploy a 5/4 thing and then have to play more creatures to get the benefit of the ETB effect to make way for their own attackers, right? You'd rather just use this as a way of getting a tapper instead in most scenarios. Outside of that, a dragon that a lot of people liked for a while or were trying was Ancient Copper Dragon. Now, this card basically reads 50-50 into winning the game on a successful attack on a player when you deal combat damage to them. So the fact that this doesn't have haste makes it very difficult to play because of how commonly this is going to get removed within a turn cycle. If this is put into play not tutored on an opponent's end step to give it pseudo haste, then all of your opponents have, an entire turn cycle to find an answer to it. And a lot of times that's all that it takes to find an answer to something. There is one card that some of the decks are still on, though, and that is the Cavern Horde Dragon. Because it having haste, and even if you tutor for it, you're attacking with it on the same turn, and you're potentially generating another 3 to 4 treasures from it. So you're getting back some of the investment cost into it, and there are plenty of games where you might be forced into a slog, especially if you're on a more Stax-heavy variant of the list. And realistically, your opponents are going to be playing more of the 2-mana rocks over time anyway, so in the mid-game something like this gets turned on. And what I mean by this is that it only costs like 4 or 5 to cast, and paying 5 for something that has haste and makes you 4 treasures the turn it comes down is absolutely insane. But realistically, other cards like Drakuseth, which was very popular when Winota was king, isn't as valuable because paying 7 for a 7/7 that essentially allows you to deal 11 damage per turn, right, to one target and then kill 2 others, is valuable, but it's only valuable in like stacked out board states or stalled out board states where you're still able to get in the air. But it is an attack target, or an attack trigger, I should say. So it does help get your creatures in, and it helps put you in a position to potentially win the game. So there might be reason to play something like this at some point again, but realistically, it's probably not going to come back. And then lastly, we have one card that really hasn't seen a whole lot of play for probably a year and a half, and that's Godrek the Crown Scourge. It only costs 3, and with more artifacts being played, and with artifacts being very common for our own deck, this is turned on quite a bit. Having a 5/4 beater for 3 is very profitable, and the fact that this turns it into, if we attack into our opponents and they block our dwarves, we now get a treasure token, is pretty powerful, because we get 1 on attack and then we'll get 1 on their death at our end step, essentially. So they have to remove Godrek before that. And the interaction with Portal to Phyrexia makes this very difficult to deal with, because if you have this in hand, you play Portal on your main phase, or during combat more likely than not. Playing this in your second main phase, after you've gotten rid of, 5 to 7 creatures potentially, generates a lot of treasures, and potentially just wins you the game. So this, along with Cavern Horde Dragon, are probably the most common dragons that you might see moving forward, but realistically, outside of that, it's very difficult to find room for them because of their cost. The only other one that has potentially had value over time was Goldspan, since it had haste, and it makes treasures in a Magda agnostic way, as well as making our treasures tap for more. But this was dropped by most pilots relatively quickly after they started adding it in. Because even though it makes treasures, and it makes treasures when it's removed, or a treasure when it's removed, it didn't really give enough. I've already gone over how to protect your win, but a lot of pilots ask, what win condition should I go for, or what combo line should I end with? And the actual answer is, it doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is if you've been silenced. Because if you've been silenced, you lose access to Lightning Bolt loops, whether that's with Barkform Harvester or Pinnacle Monk or something, right? So this limits some of your opportunities for your wins, especially if it's done at instant speed. But luckily for us, Channel is not a cast. So you can still win with Barkform Harvester lines with Twinshot Sniper's Channel ability. Or you can win with its ETB ability, using multiple roaming thrones, which I've gone over earlier in this video. So silence in particular isn't something you need to worry about. If you're worried about losing to Trick Bind, like I've already said before, when discussing protecting your win, once you've made infinite treasures, activate Magda, hold priority, activate Magda a million times. Then your opponents can't do anything about it, regardless of what line you take, because Magda can fail to find. If it's your own turn, you can also simply go grab Magda the Horde Master. It does require that you're able to put into play a Maskwood Nexus first, but at that point, as long as you are in your main phase 1, you can make infinite 4/4 red Scorpion Dragons, because it's only activated as a sorcery. And then go to combat and win the game. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if you're using a Dualcaster line, a Pinnacle Monk line, a Plundering Barbarian line with Spine of Isha to blow up all your opponent's permanents to be funny, or even using a Realm Scorcher Hellkite. It really doesn't matter what win condition you're going for. The only time it matters otherwise is if there is a 1 ring in play, and you have to win through a 1 ring. And that's only possible on your own turn, using God Pharaoh's statue, because at the end of your, or at the beginning of your end step, I should say, each opponent loses 1 life. This is non-targeted life loss. So when this trigger goes on the stack, you can cast Return the Favor, copy the trigger from God Pharaoh's statue, put it in your graveyard, grab it with Barkform Harvester, recast it. Copy this a million times, all of your opponents are dead, including your opponent with the 1 ring. But specifically outside of that scenario with the 1 ring, or a Angel's Grace, or, you know, a situation where you have been silenced, there aren't very many win conditions that you specifically have to go for, because we have all of our activations, all of our abilities are pretty much done at instant speed. With Barkform Harvester, with Magda's activation itself, with crewing, with Clock of Omens activated ability. All of this stuff is done at instant speed, so as long as you're comfortable doing your lines and you know that you can do things to force yourself to be able to interact on top, wonderful. You know, if they try to kill your Twinshot sniper in response to the ETB when you're going for the double roaming throne thing, you can immediately pivot to a lightning bolt loop or something by drawing your deck. Or you can draw some of your deck and then remove your own Twinshot sniper to put it back in your library to be tutored out again on top. There are plenty of ways around every way that your opponents can potentially interact with your win conditions, so it's just about being comfortable doing so. Warping Wail is a house of a card. It has been popularized by Rust ITG and has since been adopted by a lot of Magda pilots. The upside of this card is it is modal and it's very powerful. The first one being exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less, hits Bowmasters, hits Drannith Magistrate, hits a lot of important things in the format that are either value engines like Esper Sentinel or things that allow your opponents to potentially combo off. The next mode is counter target sorcery spell. This lets us stop things like Culling Ritual or Toxic Deluge, or important tutors like Demonic Tutor. Realistically, you know, it would be nice to be able to copy them with something like a Reverberate or a Fork, but denying the ability for that thing to resolve is not something that your opponents would expect in mono red, or in this case, a colorless card. And then lastly, we have create a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token that has sacrifice this, add colorless. Now, this is important because the second version of the Eldrazi Scion required you to tap it to sacrifice it. This does not. So if you have a Maskwood Nexus in play, you can simply tap it to a tapper, like a vehicle, in order to generate a treasure, and then be able to ramp yourself with the sacrifice ability. So now let's talk about the downside. The downside is it costs a colorless mana. So in our normal mana base, we have quite a few ways to do this. Ancient Tomb, Cavern of Souls, Command Beacon, Fomori Vault, Gemstone Caverns if it wasn't in the pregame, Mutavault, Holdout Settlement, Survivor's Encampment, Talon Gates, Treasure Vault, Urza's Cave, Urza's Saga. And then we also have our mana rocks that make colorless, so we have our Mana Vault and our Soul Ring. But because we're not able to have access to Mana Crypt anymore, it does make it a little bit harder to play. And in general, when you're on Warping Wail, you're also warping your mana base to enable it. So you're playing things like Tarnished Citadel or Ramunap Ruins, or you're going down even more red lands so that you can play things like Crystal Vein or City of Traders, as well as something like a Volatile Fault, which this card is also very good in the current meta because it gets rid of Gaia's Cradle, right? But realistically, the only way that you can sort of enable red outside of the lands like Tarnished Citadel and Ramunap Ruins, etc., is to run a card like 3-Tree Mascot to save hands that only have colorless mana, so that you can filter it into red. But it would also require you to have something like that Warping Wail in hand that gives you extra value, or if you're on a variant of the deck that is running a lot of Stax pieces, something like a Trinisphere or a early Tanglewire or something, or a Sphere of Resistance. But outside of very specific versions of the deck, like a more mid-range version of the deck would love having Warping Wail, the downside of the mana base might be too much for something like a Turbo Stax deck or a hard Stax deck, depending on the situation, and it's especially going to be hard for a pure Turbo variant of the deck to warrant that sort of a greedy mana base. The other thing is, because you're on a very heavy colorless mana base, it makes it very difficult to get consistency in your mulligans to allow you for a lot of your game plan to happen on curve where you might want the red mana available to you. Specifically if you are on a variant of the deck that is on high amounts of red-based interaction. Molten Duplication is in a league of its own, compared to Heat Shimmer Twinflame effects, because it reads, create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. So this makes it valuable outside of the situations where you can just potentially win the game with a Dualcaster Mage, or get extra value by making a copy of a creature like Roaming Throne, Xorn, or Academy Manufactor. You can copy artifacts. So primarily it's going to be used for something like a Portal to Phyrexia. Being able to get the extra ETB, clearing the board for yourself means that you are more likely going to be able to safely attack into your opponents. If you're getting low on life and you have a high counter on your One Ring, you can remove the existing One Ring by legend ruling it. You can make a copy of a Maskwood Nexus to potentially get another Shapeshifter. Or you can even use a Mana Vault as a way to ritual +1 mana. But the important part about this particular card is that it does not read make a copy of non-token, because this means you can just copy a raw treasure without having to go to combat to generate said treasure. So realistically, there's a lot more value for something like a Molten Duplication over that Heat Shimmer or a Twinflame, because those can only copy creatures, and they don't make them an artifact. So the fact that you get to make a copy of a dwarf and then win the game with Clock of Omens is also very potent. Realistically, this is the only card that you'll see in decks moving forward, even if Dualcaster Mage exists, because that backup win line of Dualcaster Mage with Twinflame or Heat Shimmer or whatever wasn't very common. And because Dockside's gone, there's almost no targets for us to actually copy for something like a Heat Shimmer, outside of maybe like Ranger Captain of Eos or other similar things that will allow you to get a Tutor for a creature. But even then, the value is rather diminished based on the restrictions of the power and toughness and stuff. But realistically, Molten Duplication is still a very strong card. The other ones just don't make the cut anymore.